December 1944. The Ardennes forests, 15 degrees below 0 Celsius. A young American soldier, he has just turned 20, stands in a snow-choked trench. His hands tremble, not from the cold. From the gray curtain of snow, through the fog of a slow dawn, a metal beast crawls out. A tiger. A German heavy tank, 56 tons of steel. Its 88mm gun swings toward the American positions. The engine growls, the tracks scrape over the frozen ground. In the soldier's hands, a tube. "Just a tube," the Germans sneered. A bazooka. The American anti-tank rocket launcher they contemptuously called a plumber's tool. Weight, about 6 kilograms. Caliber, 60mm. Effective range, roughly 120 meters. But the tank is already at 30. Step by step, it creeps closer. The soldier knows, if he doesn't fire, his platoon will die. If he fires and misses, he will. He waits a few more seconds, letting the machine come on. 20 meters, one shot. Frozen fingers squeeze the trigger. A flash, a smoky streak, impact, and sudden silence. The tiger stalls, chokes on smoke, and moves no more. That was the moment of truth for thousands of American soldiers in the Second World War. A moment when a weapon others laughed at drew the line between life and death. The story of the bazooka is a story of underestimation, rapid evolution, and human courage. When the Americans first used it in North Africa in 1942, many German tankers openly smiled. They saw their Panzers and early Tigers shrug off direct hits, heard rounds ricochet from frontal armor, and felt like an unshakable wall. But war doesn't stand still. It's a relentless race of technology and tactics. What worked in 1942 was already failing by 1944. The bazooka went from a crude experiment to one of the most effective non-portable anti-tank weapons of the war. The Americans increased the caliber, refined the ammunition, and worked out tactics for its use. This is a story of simplicity defeating complexity, of mass production prevailing over elitism, of the courage of ordinary infantrymen leveling the odds against the enemy's technical superiority. We'll talk about a weapon that could change the course of a fight, about soldiers who learned to wring the most from it, and about moments when a person with a tube on his shoulder stopped a multi-ton metal monster. It isn't only a technical tale, it's the story of a knot where technology, tactics, and character converged in the most tragic conflict of the 20th century. And a reminder that the winner isn't always the one with the best, but the one who can use what he has with the greatest precision. The bazooka's story begins not at the front, but in US laboratories and test ranges in the late 1930s. America watched Europe with growing anxiety. September 1939, the German attack on Poland showed a new logic of war, a lightning offensive in which tanks became the battering ram. The US Army saw the problem clearly. There was no effective man-portable anti-tank weapon. Rifle bullets were powerless against armor. Anti-tank guns were too heavy and unwieldy to push forward quickly with the infantry. What was needed was a weapon for 1 or 2 soldiers that could penetrate armor at a sensible distance. Captain Leslie Skinner and Lieutenant Colonel Edward Ohl of the Ordnance Department began experimenting with rocket projectiles. The idea sounded simple, but execution demanded ingenuity. A light launch tube, a recoilless shot so the soldier could shoulder the weapon, and a shaped charge that pierced armor not with ramming force, but with a focused explosive jet. The first prototypes were far from reliable. The rockets behaved capriciously, sometimes veering off course. There were dangerous misfires right in the tube. Accuracy was poor, but the work didn't stop. By June 1942, the engineers delivered a practical solution. A tube roughly 130 centimeters long, weighing about 6 kilograms, caliber 60 millimeters. The rocket, about 1.5 kilograms, theoretically penetrated up to 80 millimeters of armor, enough to give the infantry a fighting chance. The name bazooka appeared by accident. Popular comedian Bob Burns played a homemade wind instrument resembling a trombone, the bazooka. Seeing the new launch tube, someone joked that it looked like Burns's contraption. The nickname stuck instantly and became official. In August 1942, the first M1 launchers went to the troops. Production ramped up rapidly, U.S. BD-1 industrial capacity was unmatched. By year's end, about 50,000 launchers had been produced. Training was as practical as possible. How to load, how to aim, how to work as a shooter-loader team. On paper, it all seemed simple. On the battlefield, everything came down to nerves, distance, and seconds. And that was exactly what the infantry had to master. It spun November 1942. Operation Torch, the landing of American forces in North Africa. Here the bazooka first met the enemy in real combat, and here the problems surfaced that training ranges had failed to reveal. The first clash came near Oran, Algeria. An American platoon engaged French Renault R-35 tanks defending the Vichy regime. A soldier with a bazooka let one of the machines approach to roughly 50 meters and fired. A hit on the side and almost no effect. A small flash, smoke, but the tank kept rolling. A second shot, same result. The nerves of the unit began to fray. The culprit was the fuse. Early M1s had an electric igniter, overly sensitive to moisture and dust. In that climate, sandstorms, sudden rains, nearly every second rocket failed. The impact was there, but no detonation. Soldiers were losing confidence in the new weapon faster than they could learn how to use it. And yet, there were successes. In December 1942, in Tunisia, Americans ambushed a column of Panzer IIIs. They placed their teams on both sides of a narrow road, about 30 meters away. When the tanks entered the pocket, 4 rockets were launched at once. 2 tanks flared up immediately. A third was stopped with a broken track, and the fourth, while trying to turn around, took a hit in its thin rear armor and caught fire. The effect was noted on the other side as well. The Germans had not expected the GIs to possess such a weapon. But after a few encounters, disdain returned. The bazooka worked only at close range. A significant number of shots failed. Even the Panzer III's frontal armor could shrug it off. Tank crews joked that the Americans had brought plumbing pipes to war. That underestimation was a mistake. The Americans learned fast. Every malfunction was examined, every failure traced to its cause. Engineers went back to the drawing board. Instructors refined training. Units absorbed experience, both their own and that bought dearly in blood. By spring 1943, the improved M1A1 appeared, a more reliable fuse, better resistance to dust and moisture, more consistent ammunition. Effectiveness grew noticeably, but the most serious changes were still to come, and they concerned not only the hardware, but the way it was used. American engineers clearly saw the limits of the 60mm 2.36-inch system. Its balance of weight and penetration was fine against lighter machines, but it performed worse and worse against upgraded Panzer IVs and the arrival of the Panther and Tiger. The 80mm of penetration on paper didn't guarantee results in the field, especially against sloped armor or frontal plates. In summer 1943, a thorough redesign of the launcher began. This produced the M9, and later the M9A1, still 60mm, but far more mature technologically. A 2-piece collapsible design for easier transport, a pistol grip, improved sights, and more reliable electrics. At the same time, the rockets were upgraded. New fuse types and a refined shaped charge delivered steadier performance in real conditions. The first M9s reached the troops in January 1944, just in time for the Italian campaign, where mountains and serpentine roads restricted tanks to narrow paths. For the infantry, this meant perfect ambush territory. Close ranges weren't an act of bravery, but dictated by geography. Private James Carter of the 80th Infantry Division wrote in his diary, "Yesterday I fired the new bazooka for the first time. It feels different, more power, more confidence. We set up an ambush near Casino. A tiger crawled uphill. We held the slope 40 meters above. A shot to the roof of the turret. Tank stopped, smoke rising. The crew bailed and ran. What seemed unbreakable 2 months ago now falls to a single accurate hit. Compromises remained. Even the 2.36-inch rockets were bulky. Each man could only carry a few, and ammunition ran out fast. The collapsible tube did help with transport, but assembling it under fire demanded cold blood and practice. Development never paused. Optics were improved. Sight markings were adjusted for varying ranges, and new ammunition types were tested. Standard heat rounds, smoke rounds for screens and concealment, and inert practice rockets for safe training. Importantly, tactical thinking evolved alongside, from just shoot at the silhouette to strict focus on weak spots, sides, rear, roof, vulnerable joints like hatches and turret rings, to operating in pairs and launching volleys from the closest killing range. But the real evolution was not so much the metal as the men and their tactics. That was what turned the bazooka from a pipe for jokes into a tool that forced heavy armor to slow, halt, and retreat. Facing a German Tiger was a trial of nerves for any infantryman. 56 tons of armor, frontal plate about 100 millimeters, sides up to 80 millimeters, an 88 millimeter gun capable of accurate fire over kilometers, knocking out Shermans before they could close in. The Tiger was more than a machine. It was a symbol of technical supremacy, designed to dominate the battlefield. When the first Tigers appeared in Tunisia in 1943, bazooka men instinctively aimed at the front. The outcome was predictable. Shaped charges skidded off the armor, leaving dents but no critical damage. The turret turned slowly, one blast from the 88, and the position, along with its gunner, vanished. The Americans adapted quickly. Field manuals laid down simple but brutal rules. Never fire at a Tiger from the front. It's suicide. The sides are vulnerable at the right angle and at close range. The rear is the weakest point, about 60 millimeters. Tracks, road wheels, and the engine transmission compartment are prime targets for immobilization. After that, finishing the tank is easier. Sergeant William Thompson of the 2nd Armored Division described the pattern that became standard: the triangle of death. 3 bazooka teams took up the corners of an imaginary triangle along the tank's path, 30 to 40 meters apart. When the Tiger passed the first position, that gunner struck at the tracks, not to destroy, but to halt. As the crew reacted, the second gunner hit the side, the third the rear. It demanded iron discipline. The first shooter had to let the beast crawl past within a few meters, without betraying himself by sound or movement. A premature shot meant the turret swung toward the flash, and the position was obliterated. In January 1944, near Anzio, a group of infantrymen used this method against 3 Tigers pushing an assault. The first tank was crippled with a track shot. Within 30 seconds, its side and rear were hit 4 times. It burst into flames. The second Tiger, trying to escape the pocket, turned its rear toward the Americans. A fatal mistake. 3 rockets into the engine almost simultaneously, and the vehicle burned. The third, seeing the trap, accelerated and withdrew, unwilling to risk its crew. After such encounters, German tankers changed their habits, never entering narrow streets without infantry support, never halting in places likely to conceal ambushes, keeping the tanks moving constantly, even at the cost of fuel. A stationary Tiger was a dead Tiger, but the real fear didn't come in daylight. The real fear came in the dark. Night changed the rules. What gave tank crews a sense of safety by day turned into blindness in the dark. Infantrymen were invisible, the direction of threat unknown. Every shadow might conceal a man with a tube. The Americans developed a simple but calculated method of night operations. Small groups of 3 or 4, a bazooka gunner, his loader carrying extra rockets, and 1 or 2 men for cover. By day they observed German tank routes, marked bivouacs, noted approaches. By night they crawled forward. The practice was always the same: 3 or 4 in the morning, when fatigue weighed heaviest on tank crews. Approach to within 20 or 30 meters. Aim for the engine compartment or ammunition rack, the spots most likely to ignite or explode. 1 shot. An immediate withdrawal into darkness before the enemy grasped what had happened. Private Robert Marshall described one such raid in a letter home. "We went out at 3. The moon was behind clouds, almost pitch dark. We knew 4 Panthers were parked near a burned-out house half a kilometer from our lines. We crawled nearly an hour. At 20 meters, I heard someone snoring inside one of the tanks. My heart was pounding so hard I thought they'd hear it. Jones, our gunner, took the last machine in line. The shot tore through the silence. For an instant, everything lit up like daylight. We ran back without looking. We heard shouts, wild bursts of fire into the night. In the morning, we looked through binoculars. The tank still smoldered, burned out completely. The effect was not just tactical, but psychological. Crews stopped sleeping soundly. Every rustle could mean a bazooka team creeping closer. Among Germans spread tales of Yankee ghosts who appeared from the night, struck, and vanished. Some carried grenades not for attack, but to use on themselves if their tank caught fire and they couldn't get out. U.S. DIWA Command noted the results and began deliberately training night hunter squads, small teams specializing in nocturnal strikes against armor. By late 1944, every division had such units, better prepared, sharper instructions, dedicated support. They spread fear and eroded the confidence of enemy tank units before dawn ever broke. December 16, 1944, around 5 in the morning, the Ardennes forests erupt in fire and steel, Germany's last great offensive in the West. Operation Wacht am Rhein, known to the Allies as the Battle of the Bulge. More than 250,000 German soldiers, hundreds of tanks and assault guns. Among them, battalions of heavy Tigers and the newest Tiger II, Königstiger, nearly 70 tons apiece, frontal turret armor up to 180 millimeters. American units along the attack axis were caught off guard. Some formations still carried early 2.36-inch M1, A1 bazookas. Newer M9, M901 models, also 60 millimeters, had not yet reached everyone. Weather, snow, fog, 15 below zero. Perfect for masking the German advance, disastrous for the defenders. Aircraft grounded, visibility poor, communications unreliable. Two keys remained to the Americans. First, experience. By late 1944, thousands of soldiers had fought through France and Italy and knew how to stop armor. Second, desperation had no back door. There was nowhere to retreat. Either hold or die where they stood. Near the town of St. Vith, a platoon from the 106th Infantry Division ambushed a German column. They had only 4 M9 bazookas and 12 rockets. The column included 2 Tigers, 3 Panthers, and several Panzer IVs. Success seemed nearly impossible. Lieutenant Charles Rogers devised a simple, desperate plan. He placed all 4 bazooka teams on one side of a forest road, in a snowy ditch spaced about 5 meters apart. The idea was brutally pragmatic. Let the lead Tiger pass, strike the second vehicle, a Panther, block the road, and then finish whatever was trapped. Around 8 in the morning, the column rolled in. The first Tiger, engine roaring, passed the ditch. Americans lay motionless, breathing frozen air. Behind came the Panther. Rogers waved, and 4 rockets fired almost together. 3 struck the Panther, it stalled, smoking. The 4th sheared the running gear of a Panzer IV behind it. The column froze. The lead Tiger began to turn, but on the narrow path, it took precious seconds. The bazooka men reloaded and fired again. The Panther was now ablaze, firmly blocking the road. 2 Panzer IVs were hit. One erupted in flames, the other abandoned by its crew who slipped into the woods. When the Tiger finally swung its gun into action, Rogers ordered withdrawal in scattered fashion. They crawled back through snow. 3 were killed under fire, the rest escaped. The German column remained stalled on that stretch for 6 hours until engineers dragged the burnt Panther aside. Such stories were counted by the hundreds in the Ardennes. Small groups, often cut off from main forces, held frozen lines and let the armor come within impossible distances. Reports from the first week claimed that infantry bazooka teams knocked out or crippled over 100 German tanks and assault guns, at road junctions, in villages, in forest pockets, where the outcome was measured in meters, angles, and one single well-placed rocket. December 20th, 1944. Bastogne, Belgium, encircled. The 101st Airborne Division, about 8,000 men, cut off from the rest of the army. No reinforcements, ammunition running low, evacuation impossible. The Germans held armored superiority. Dozens of Panthers, Tigers, and Panzer IVs against a garrison virtually without tanks inside the ring. The defense relied on infantry, mortars, a few guns, and bazookas on the perimeter. German Commander General Heinrich von Luttwitz sent an ultimatum: surrender within 2 hours or be destroyed. Acting Garrison Commander General Anthony McAuliffe's reply entered history with a single word: nuts. In essence, not a chance, in a blunter tone. But words didn't halt armor. Tanks pushed in from all sides. and the only thing between them and the garrison were bazooka teams stretched along streets and fields. Sergeant Paul Martin of the 101st described one attack. They came in column from the Foy side. I counted 9 tanks. We had 15 rockets for the whole company, no room for a miss. Captain Jones decided to hit them where the road narrows between 2 houses. We let the first 2 tanks pass, took aim at the third, a Tiger. 2 shots into the side. The machine stopped, started smoking. The 4th tank, a Panther, tried to detour across open ground, bogged in snow. We got that one too. The rest of the column halted. German infantry jumped down to attack, and we slipped away through cellars. This tactic repeated again and again during the siege. The Americans couldn't win in open ground, but they forced the enemy to pay for every meter. Streets became traps. Houses turned into firing points for tubes. Tankers increasingly refused to enter the town without thick infantry cover. On December 23rd, the skies cleared enough for airdrops. C-47s showered the town with containers of ammunition, medicine, food. Among the most critical, crates of bazooka rockets. The defense had teeth again. The sharpest moment came December 26th. Patton's Third Army broke the ring. Tanks of the 4th Armored Division were the first into Bastogne. The siege was lifted. The garrison had endured against all odds. And Germany's winter offensive, meant to turn the war's tide, had choked in the Ardennes snow. After the battle, German generals searched for reasons for failure. Beyond weather, fuel shortages, and Allied air power, reports more and more mentioned fanatical resistance of American infantry with their anti-tank tubes. The bazooka, once an object of ridicule, had become a weapon heavy machines learned to fear. March 1945. The Western Allies prepare for the largest river operation since Normandy, the crossing of the Rhine. Operation Plunder is meant to open the road into the heart of Germany. The Reich's command knows the price of this line and concentrates whatever remains on the eastern bank, including armored reserves. Among them, even some Tiger IIs, armor that a 2.36-inch M9 can penetrate only with luck into a weak point and at point-blank range. On March 23rd, the crossing begins. The first waves go over in boats and on pontoons under mortar and machine gun fire. With them, small anti-tank teams armed with bazookas. The task formula is simple. The execution is not. Establish a foothold, keep German counterattacks from reaching the water, and hold the bridgehead until proper crossings are built for the main forces. Corporal Thomas Davis of the 9th Infantry is in the first wave. We made it across around 4 in the morning. Dark, wet, mines splashing along the crossing. Half our boat got hit while we were still on the water. I lost my bazooka in the river, took one from a dead buddy, 1 rocket left. We dug in among ruins about 50 meters from the bank. At 6 we heard engines, 3 tanks, 2 Panzer IVs, and a Panther. I knew I had one chance. I waited until the Panther came to about 20 meters, took aim at the joint between turret and hull, the weak spot, and fired. Hit. The machine stopped, the turret jammed. The crew bailed and our guys cut them down. The 2 Panzer IVs turned around and pulled back. Why? I don't know. Maybe they decided there were more of us than there were, or maybe they were just scared. In war, psychology sometimes matters as much as caliber. The next 48 hours on the bridgehead were grueling. The Germans threw armor into counterattacks again and again, trying to shove the first waves back into the Rhine. But every attempt broke on combined fire. Anti-tank guns, bazookas, artillery, and aircraft. By March 25th, the bridgehead held firm. Massive crossings began. A telling detail. After the war, German military historians noted that tank crews consistently overestimated the number of American anti-tank assets on the bank. Reports spoke of massed AT batteries, when in reality, it was a handful of mobile bazooka teams quickly shifting positions and creating a sense of being everywhere. That speaks to the power of impression. Sometimes the psychological pressure of a weapon weighs as much as its spec sheet. After the Ardennes and countless encounters with tubes, German crews saw bazookas even where there were only a few, and that was enough to blunt their push and give the bridgehead time to grow into a road deep into Germany. April 1945. American and British units drive into Germany. Every town is a fortress, every house a bunker. The order from Berlin is simple and merciless. Hold every meter. In street fighting, tanks lose their edge. Restricted maneuver, dead zones, short distances. And here the bazooka becomes a first-line tool. In the city, the weapon operates in ideal conditions: close range, abundant cover, and the ability to fire from windows, basements, and rooftops. A tanker entering a street finds himself in a three-dimensional maze where threats come from above, below, and the flanks. The fighting for Cologne in March 1945 became practically a textbook of urban anti-tank work. The Germans dragged in anything they could, including captured vehicles. The Allies, for their part, conducted a methodical block-by-block clearance. A typical operation looked like this. An infantry platoon enters a block. 2 bazooka men take upper floors on opposite sides of the street, lowering their shooting angle and covering the roof turret ring. 2 more wait in basements. It's covering side armor and running gear. The rest of the platoon shields them from German infantry, sealing intersections and approaches. When a tank enters the corridor, it receives crossfire in several planes at once. Sergeant Michael O'Connor recalled one episode. A panther was crawling in cautiously, turret sweeping back and forth. They knew we were there. I was on the 3rd floor, aiming down at the thin roof. Jones was in the basement across the street, on the side plate. The tank stopped in the middle of the street. I fired first, into the turret roof. Small blast, but the tank jolted and froze. A moment later, Jones hit the side, smoke started, then Rodriguez fired from the next building. The machine went up. The crew tried to bail, but the crossfire left them no time even to get their bearings. The city also revealed another strength of the bazooka: versatility. Beyond armor, it smashed firing points, blew holes through interior walls to create mouse runs, and worked against pillboxes and barricades. Units carried different rocket types, the heat rounds as primary, plus smoke and fragmentation for fortifications and troops, selecting ammunition to fit the task. By the end of April, as resistance finally buckled, the bazooka had become a routine tool in American hands. Movements were honed to reflex, position, angle, weak point, shot, shift. What had looked like a crude experiment 2 years earlier had become a reliable, predictable means that saved thousands of lives, block by block, house by house. When the guns fell silent in May 1945, Army analysts opened the reports. The numbers were striking. Over 3 years of active use, the forces received more than 450,000 bazooka launchers of various models and over 15 million rockets. The Ledger's list confirmed German armored losses to bazookas, more than 3,500 vehicles. Behind the dry lines are human stories. Every knocked-out tank was a platoon that didn't get crushed under tracks. Every successful ambush meant dozens who came home. In veterans' memoirs after the war, the bazooka appears again and again, not as a magic wand, but as a chance. The possibility to stop what had seemed inevitable yesterday. Comparative figures spoke for themselves. The early 60mm 2.36-inch M1 delivered an average effectiveness of about 30%. Roughly every third shot disabled a target. In the improved 2.36-inch M9, thanks to a more reliable fuse, sights, and better ammunition, this rose to roughly 55%. By comparison, anti-tank guns closed the kill task more often, around 70%. But they were hard to redeploy quickly, whereas the bazooka moved with the infantry. The most telling number? Distance. The average range of a successful bazooka hit was about 38 meters, almost point blank. German tank guns worked at kilometers. The man with the tube had to approach so close he could feel the engine's vibration, and still hold his aim. Lieutenant James Wilson, who became a military historian after the war, wrote, "People often ask me why the bazooka worked, given it lagged behind other systems on technical specs. The answer is simple. It was there, where it needed to be, when it needed to be. The Germans had an excellent Panzerfaust, but not always in the right numbers and places. They had superb anti-tank guns, but you can't carry them by hand. The bazooka was in every platoon, and in a week a soldier could learn to use it well enough to stop a breakthrough. The economics of war are ruthless. The procurement cost of one M9 to the US government, roughly $40, one rocket, about $18. A German Tiger cost roughly 250,000 Reichsmarks, around $100,000 in pre-war terms. For the price of one Tiger, U.S. industry turned out thousands of launchers and thousands of rockets. But the most important statistic isn't money. Medical service estimates in comparable units suggest that the presence of bazookas reduced casualties from tank attacks by roughly 45%. Behind those percentages are thousands of lives saved, people who survived the front and went on to live long, peaceful lives. After the capitulation, the Allies gained mountains of documents, crew reports, manuals, private letters. Through them, you can trace how attitudes toward the bazooka changed. The first mentions, November 1942, North Africa. The Americans use a primitive rocket weapon, effectiveness low, poses no significant threat. The tone is dismissive, and so it was. Early ammunition often failed. By mid-1943, Italy. American anti-tank tube shows improved effectiveness, recommended to avoid close contact with enemy infantry. Contempt gave way to caution. Autumn 1944. France. Enemy infantry armed with 2.36-inch rocket launchers of high effectiveness. Reports sometimes exaggerate caliber to 90 millimeters. Entry into towns without infantry escort forbidden. Side and rear vulnerable. On contact with anti-tank groups. Withdrawal or call for support. This was no longer caution. This was fear of losing tank and crew in urban pockets. A particularly vivid voice comes from the diary of Oberleutnant Kurt Schmidt, platoon commander of Tigers in the 501st Heavy Battalion. January 1945. Third loss this week, and again from an American tube. Hands burned alive. He didn't make it out. Crews refused to enter villages without artillery prep. The battalion commander threatens court-martial. But what can he do? Shoot us all. Worst of all is the uncertainty. You don't know where they are. In every shadow there may be a team. One shot, and 56 tons of steel become a coffin. Yesterday I saw a Panther hit in the engine. The crew got out, but the machine burned to the ground in 3 minutes. Years of factory work, wrecked by a pipe that cost pennies. The psychological effect was enormous. The bazooka didn't just slow attacks and raise the cost of every meter. It broke the sense of invulnerability. Crews began to see threat everywhere. The Germans tried to adapt. Tactics, zigzagging, changing tempo, unpredictable routes. Add-on protection, skirts on sides and rear, spare tracks, chains, sandbags. Anything to trigger premature detonation or spoil the shape charge's angle. But the clearest answer was their own rocket launcher, the Panzerschreck, Raketenpanzerbüchse 43-54. Same principle, enlarged to 88 millimeters, with a shield for the gunner. Yesterday's laughingstock had become today's model, copied, enlarged, and perfected for German needs. Thus unfolded the evolution of perception, from primitive tube to a factor that forced heavy tanks to pull back and wait for infantry. And that may be the best evidence of the bazooka's real value, not just in numbers, but in how it changed enemy behavior. One of the most fascinating sides of the bazooka's story is how it was refined right at the front. Army engineers issued official updates, but soldiers often stayed ahead with field solutions. A common field modification: improved aiming. The standard M9 sight was simple and reliable, but beyond 50 meters it demanded precise judgment of angle and range. Some teams strapped captured optical sights, removed from Kar 98K rifles or others, onto the tube with wire or clamps. Officially, this was forbidden as unauthorized modification of issue weapon, but in practice officers often looked the other way, because it worked. Sergeant David Brown of the 3rd Infantry Division was one pioneer of such tuning. After Metz, I took a Kar 98K scope, taped it to the tube with wire and insulation tape. Looked awful, but it gave me a chance. First shot was from about 80 meters, hit a Panzer IV in the turret. Before that, I wouldn't even have tried from such range. Second line of fixes, gunner safety. On firing, the backblast of gas and flame scorched everything behind. Outdoors, manageable. Indoors, trenches or bunkers. It was dangerous. Burns, concussions, dust ignition. To reduce risks, soldiers improvised. Homemade deflectors, shields from armor plates, sandbag, pockets behind them, or simply strict control of the clear zone before firing. Third, camouflage. The standard dark green finish worked in forests but stood out in towns or snow. Teams repainted tubes for the setting, white paint or cloth wraps in winter, gray tones with brick-like blotches in cities, jagged green-brown patterns in woods. This made the tube blend into background and cut betraying reflections. Engineers carefully tracked what the front did. Some field solutions later appeared in official upgrades. Better sights, more reliable electrics, easier breakdown and carrying, tighter seals against dust and moisture, a rare case of bureaucracy listening to those carrying the tube daily. The culmination of evolution was the 3.5-inch M20 Super Bazooka, a project maturing late in the war, finished after its end. Caliber 3.5 inches, about 88.9 millimeters, improved ballistics, and a stronger shaped charge gave major penetration gains. It barely reached Europe before the war ended. Its true moment came in Korea, where it proved why it had been built. An interesting note: after the war, Allies questioned German armor engineers about what design changes they had to make because of the bazooka. One Henschel specialist replied, "We added skirts, reinforced sides, reworked fuel tank placement, but the main problem wasn't in the metal, the main problem was in the heads." Our tankers began to fear. And when a tanker fears, even the best tank in the world becomes less effective. That phrase sums up the bazooka's role. It wasn't a wonder weapon that could always punch through. It was a psychological equalizer, giving the infantryman a chance against armor, and that was enough to shift the balance of the battlefield. When the smoke cleared, staffs and analysts drew conclusions. The bazooka stood in the spotlight as proof of concept. One soldier, with a simple and relatively cheap launcher, could threaten complex and expensive armor. The Soviet Union studied this closely. During the war, the Red Army had relied mainly on anti-tank rifles and hand-thrown grenades, RPG-43, RPG-6, and heavily used captured Panzerfausts. After the war, Soviet designers fielded their own rocket launchers, most notably the RPG-2, blending their work with lessons from American and German practice: simplicity, mass issue, ruggedness in the field. The British, who had used the spring-powered PIAT, moved post-war to rocket systems of the same concept, including adopting 3.5-inch Super Bazookas, and later developed new standard models. France, rebuilding its army, bought US launchers until it rolled out its own versions. Even in West Germany, building the Bundeswehr in the 1950s, infantry units adopted modern anti-tank weapons shaped by the bazooka and Faust legacy: compact, simple, designed for a trained soldier at squad level. The irony of history: the nation whose tankers once mocked the plumber's tube now armed its own troops with kin weapons. Military officer and historian John Weeks summed up the lesson simply: weapons must be good enough in three things: mass production, single soldier portability, and field reliability. In following decades, engineers chased the ideal. Guided systems appeared, TOW, in the 1970s, and the leap to fire and forget came with Javelin in the 1990s. Yet the benchmark of practicality remained the bazooka. It did its job where and when needed. The concept's influence stretched beyond anti-tank roles. The portable rocket principle and shaped charge effect became standard across munitions, from armor-piercing warheads to engineering charges. The idea of easy to carry, quick to use, became the common language of infantry fire support. Post-war U.S. combat reviews listed the bazooka among the most influential infantry weapons of the Second World War, not just for the tanks it destroyed, but for its moral effect. A unit with reliable tubes felt safer against armor. That directly improved steadiness, decision-making, and holding the line. Statistics speak in numbers, but behind every line is a person. A soldier gripping a bazooka with trembling hands as a steel machine bears down on him. He has seconds to choose: shoot or pull back, live or die. The story of Private Edward Beale of the 82nd Airborne. January 1945, somewhere in Belgium. The platoon blundered into an ambush. A Panther cut off the retreat. Beale had the only bazooka in the group. 22 years old, a kid from a small town in Nebraska. Before the war, he had only seen tanks in photographs. Now one stood between him and home. Half a century later, he recalled, "I didn't think. Instincts and training took over. I crawled as close as my nerves would let me, maybe 20 meters. The turret was already slewing onto our boys. I hit the side, somewhere between the road wheels. The blast and the machine stopped. I was already flying back into the trench. I remember only hitting the dirt and shaking non-stop. The CO gave me a double ration of rum. It didn't help. Later, his buddies told him he had saved their lives. Maybe, Beale would say, I just didn't want to die. I wanted to go home, to my parents, my girl. The bazooka gave me a chance, a small one, but a chance, and I took it. He lived to 93, raised 3 children and 6 grandchildren, taught school, and kept saying, not a hero, just a soldier who did his job and survived. The story of Corporal Joseph Santos, a Mexican-American from Texas. He shot the bazooka so precisely his unit called him the artist. Near Aachen in October 1944, he knocked out 4 German vehicles in a single day and received the Silver Star. But that was not what he valued most. The best moment, Santos said, was after a fight when a new kid came up and whispered, "Thank you. If you hadn't stopped that tank, we'd be gone." And he cried, 20 years old. I hugged him and said, "We hold each other up here. That's why we live. Medals get lost. Knowing you save people, that stays." In April 1945, Santos was killed by a fragment, 2 weeks before Germany's capitulation. His name is carved on a stone at Arlington among tens of thousands of others. There are thousands of such stories, different faces, different towns and farms across America. One thing in common, ordinary people found themselves in extraordinary circumstances, with a simple weapon and a heavy responsibility. They were afraid, uncertain, sometimes panicked, but they did their jobs, and the bazooka gave them a tool that turned fear into a chance, and a chance into life. Today, bazookas stand in glass cases in military museums around the world, silent witnesses to the past. Beside them, placards with specifications, photographs, sometimes short tales of the soldiers who shouldered those tubes. At the National Second World War Museum in New Orleans, there is a dedicated exhibit. Visitors are handed a deactivated copy, to feel the weight, to look through the simple sight. Docents, often veterans of later conflicts, recount episodes decided in seconds. Children listen, holding their breath. Adults often wipe their eyes, especially those whose relatives fought that war. The bazooka has become part of popular culture. It appears in films and series, from Saving Private Ryan to documentary cycles. Not always exact in the details, but its presence is a reminder of the infantry tube's role against armor. Veterans organizations still meet yearly. They are fewer. Time spares no one. Those who come bring photographs, young faces, uniforms, a launcher on the shoulder. "Here I am, 44 France," says a 97-year-old, pointing at a black and white frame. "Here's my bazooka. It dragged me back from the other side 3 times. War colleges study the bazooka as a case of rapid development and mass fielding. Students see a convergence of 3 factors. A simple concept, thought-out tactics, systematic training. For a weapon is not only metal and explosives, it is also people able to use it at the right moment in the right way. There is a symbolic layer to this story. The bazooka was not the best by every metric. German Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks surpassed it chiefly in penetration. Soviet anti-tank rifles excelled in accuracy against lightly armored targets. British fixed guns punched through more armor. But the bazooka was where it needed to be, in sufficient numbers, in trained hands, at a time when every yard and every ravine could become a firing position. That is a lesson beyond the military. Perfection often loses to the good enough that is available now. Quantity can outweigh ideal quality. Simplicity sometimes beats sophistication. And above all, behind any technology stand people. The bazooka worked not because it was an engineering marvel, but because ordinary, tired, frightened soldiers found the will to crawl within 20 meters of a multi-ton machine and press the trigger. Their courage, steadiness, and desire to protect their buddies made the launcher effective. The bazooka began the war as an experiment with a shaky reputation and ended it as one of the symbols of the American infantry. Those who first mocked the plumber's tube eventually watched it halt a tiger at 20 paces. But the real story is about people, about engineers who ceaselessly refine the design, about soldiers who learn to act precisely under the worst conditions. about commanders who searched for tactical answers, about factory workers who turned out thousands of launchers on the line, and about infantrymen who, with that tube on their shoulder, stepped out to meet a tank. What should we take away? First, never underestimate an opponent. Arrogance is costly. The Germans paid for it with hundreds of burned machines. Second, simplicity often defeats complexity. The bazooka was not exotic engineering, yet it did the job. Third, people matter more than metal. The best system is useless in the hands of a demoralized or untrained fighter. Today, 8 decades on, the great-grandchildren of those infantrymen are growing up in a world far more peaceful than their forebears knew. A sliver of that peace lies in the fact that ordinary people with ordinary weapons once stopped one of the 20th century's most dangerous war machines. The bazooka did not win the war by itself. Victory was built by millions of people, tens of thousands of tanks, hundreds of thousands of aircraft, and countless shells and bombs. U.S. industrial might, Soviet manpower, British endurance, each played a part. But in that grand symphony of victory, the bazooka played a modest yet distinct part. And perhaps the truest lesson is this: victory is made of thousands of small moments. One soldier, one launcher, one shot, one stopped tank, one platoon saved. Multiply that by countless instances, and you get the result. They laughed at the bazooka until it stopped a tiger at 20 meters. After that, there was no room for sarcasm, only the stark reality of war, where sometimes a simple tube in brave hands proves stronger than 50 tons of steel. And in that lies the central lesson. The winner is not always the one with the best. The winner is the one who squeezes the most from what he has, refuses to yield when the odds are thin, and finds the grit to come close enough to say, "No, you go no farther." September 1944, northern France. At dawn, a German officer raised his binoculars and almost dropped them in shock. Where the day before, hundreds of Sherman tanks had stood silent and lifeless, now thousands of engines thundered. Vehicles that should have remained stranded without fuel for weeks were suddenly moving forward, as if brought to life by an invisible hand. German intelligence could not believe its eyes. How had the Americans resurrected an armored army overnight? It defied logic and calculation. The answer was hidden in a name that meant nothing to the enemy at the time: Red Ball Express. An operation only briefly mentioned after the war, but without it, the liberation of Europe might have ground to a halt. It was a mad race of trucks that turned French roads into endless arteries of supply. And it was black drivers, men who in their own country were not even trusted to sit beside white soldiers, who became the ones that kept the American advance alive. To grasp the scale of the Red Ball Express, we must go back to August 1944. The Normandy landings had already taken place. On June 6th, the Allies broke through the Atlantic Wall, marking the turning point of the war. But rapid successes spawned a new danger. The armies of Generals Patton and Hodges surged forward so fast that their own supply lines could not keep up. Patton's Third Army advanced 50 kilometers a day, smashing German defenses. But every Sherman tank burned nearly 200 liters of fuel per 100 kilometers. Every GMC truck, about 50 liters. 500,000 soldiers needed food, water, medicine, ammunition, spare parts. And all of it had to be hauled from the ports in Normandy, now far behind the front. Railroads were blown up, bridges destroyed, roads in ruins. On August 25, 1944, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower received a grim report. In 3 days, the tanks would stop. Fuel would be gone, the offensive frozen, and the Germans would regroup and strike back. Everything won at Normandy's beaches was at risk because of gasoline. A decision had to be made immediately, and so an idea was born, one that at first seemed pure madness. Chapter 1. The Birth of an Impossible Plan, 3 to 4 minutes. On August 25th at Allied headquarters, an emergency meeting was called. Colonel John C. H. Lee and his logistics officers proposed a plan that sounded fantastic. Create a conveyor of trucks operating around the clock without weekends, hauling fuel and ammunition straight from the ports of Cherbourg and Utah Beach to the front. Roads would be closed to all other traffic, only convoys allowed. The scale was colossal. Thousands of vehicles, Tens of thousands of drivers, fueling stations along the route, repair depots, radio communication, military police, protection against sabotage. And it all had to be built in just 48 hours. What normally took months to prepare now had to work in 2 days. Eisenhower approved. The name came from railroad slang. Red Ball meant express delivery of highest priority. On August 27th, signs with red circles appeared on French roads. Their message was simple: clear the way. The work fell mainly on Quartermaster Corps units. Most of them were made up of African American soldiers. In 1944, the U.S. Army was still segregated. Black troops were assigned mostly to transport and construction, rarely trusted with combat. Yet they became the backbone of the most crucial operation of the campaign. On August 29th, the first Red Ball Express convoys rolled out. 600 GMC CCKW 2.5-ton trucks. Instructions were simple: drive at maximum speed, stop for nothing but breakdowns or attack, deliver the load, and immediately return. The route stretched nearly 600 kilometers one way, 15 hours of driving without rest. The Germans noticed the traffic right away, but they did not grasp the scale. They thought it was ordinary transport, easy to disrupt with airstrikes or sabotage. They were wrong. The Americans had not just created a column, they had built a living organism, one that breathed supply and kept the front alive. By mid-September, the Red Ball Express reached its peak. 6,000 trucks moved along French roads at once. 23,000 drivers and mechanics kept them running. Routes were divided. One road eastbound for supplies, another westbound for empty returns. Military police stopped all unauthorized vehicles. Violators faced up to 3 months' imprisonment. Every 50 kilometers, maintenance stations worked non-stop. If a truck could not be repaired in minutes, it was pushed aside, cargo transferred, and the convoy pressed on. Every minute lost meant liters of fuel and soldiers' lives at the front. Fueling became an invention of its own. Tankers drove alongside and pumped gasoline directly on the move. It was deadly risky: spills, sparks, explosions. But it saved time. In its first month, the Red Ball Express delivered 130,000 tons of cargo, enough fuel to keep 3,000 tanks fighting for a week. Drivers worked to exhaustion. Shifts ran 16 to 18 hours behind the wheel. Sleep, 3 to 4 hours in the cab. Old 19th century roads crumbled under the weight. Asphalt cracked, potholes deepened to the knee. Steering an overloaded truck without power steering at 40 kilometers per hour was a feat in itself. Accidents were daily, 18 serious crashes on average per day. Drivers fell asleep, skidded on turns, trucks overturned and burned. In the first 2 months, 137 drivers were killed. Around 1,000 wounded, losses comparable to combat units, though officially they were rear services. Yet the greatest obstacle was not the enemy or the roads. It was their own commander's prejudice. Most drivers were black. Even at war, they remained second class. White officers dined freely in French restaurants where black drivers were denied entry. They were saving the army, yet could not sit at the same table with those they supplied. September 3rd, 1944. One of the most stunning demonstrations of wartime logistics. Patton's Third Army had nearly run out of fuel near Verdun. 300 Sherman tanks, 200 Stuarts, armored carriers and tractors, all stood idle. At that moment, German retreats could harden into new defenses. If Patton's tanks stopped for even a day, the Allied advance might be delayed for months. Red Ball headquarters received a non-negotiable order: deliver 3,000 tons of fuel to Verdun by dawn. That meant throwing every reserve onto one route. 2,000 trucks rolled out of Normandy at once, the largest single convoy of the operation. The column stretched almost 120 kilometers. Locals who watched the headlights at night later described it as a river of fire flowing across the land. German intelligence spotted it quickly. The Luftwaffe still had night squadrons in France. At 23:36, 16 Junkers Ju 88s, some accounts say 36, lifted off from Metz with orders: destroy the convoy or block it so completely that supplies stopped. Pilots were told not to return until the job was done. It was one of the Luftwaffe's last major air efforts in France. At 1 o'clock in the morning, the attack began. First bombs fell near Chaumont, blowing craters and setting 2 trucks ablaze. The convoy slowed, but did not stop. Drivers swerved onto shoulders, fields, and back to the road. American anti-air batteries lit the sky with tracers and blasts. Several Ju-88s were shot down. Others dropped bombs blindly. Despite fires on both sides of the road and shrapnel tearing through cabins, the convoy held together. The drivers knew if the cargo did not reach its destination, men at the front would die without fuel and ammunition. That responsibility turned mechanics of the road into deciders of battle. Sacrifice was real and brutal. Private James Thompson, 23 from Georgia, was hit by shrapnel that nearly tore off his left arm. He kept driving one-handed for 30 kilometers until he passed out from blood loss. Another driver took the wheel and delivered the load. Stories like his repeated dozens of times that night. By 5 o'clock, the convoy reached Verdun's outskirts. The Luftwaffe had withdrawn after heavy losses, their attacks no longer effective. American losses that night: 23 trucks destroyed, 36 damaged, 41 drivers killed. But 2,550 tons of fuel arrived, enough to refuel Patton's entire Third Army and supply the artillery. At 6 o'clock, Patton's tanks roared forward again, smashing German lines. German commanders were stunned. They had reports of successful attacks on the convoy. They knew the Americans were short of fuel, yet the tanks moved, and that shattered their expectations. At Army Group B headquarters, under Field Marshal Walter Model, confusion and despair reigned. Officers spread out maps, traced routes, and tried to grasp the logistical capabilities of their enemy. By every Prussian textbook, the American advance should have halted by early September. Supply lines were overextended. Normandy's ports had limited capacity, and France's transport infrastructure lay in ruins. Yet the American offensive did not slow. Wehrmacht analysts searched for rational explanations. They pointed to U.S. industrial power, limitless resources, and the ability to mass repair and replace equipment. But in their conclusions, they missed the central fact. The Red Ball Express was above all about people. Thousands of black soldiers, labeled second class in America, worked themselves to exhaustion, died on the roads, and never stopped. On September 10th, the elite Brandenburg unit was ordered to break the flow. 50 of their best commandos, disguised in American uniforms, prepared an ambush near Reims, switch road signs, redirect a convoy onto a mine stretch, blow up the lead trucks, and trigger a traffic jam. The plan was simple and brutal, but the Americans had anticipated such tricks. Every convoy had a military police escort and constant radio contact with headquarters. When drivers spotted suspicious signs, they reported immediately. Within 10 minutes, a counterintelligence detachment arrived. The confrontation escalated into a short but fierce firefight. 32 Germans were killed, the rest captured. The convoy was delayed only 20 minutes. Mines were cleared, the ambush failed. Operation Brandenburg collapsed. After a series of such failed attempts, German commanders realized conventional methods could not stop the Red Ball Express. What was needed was a massive air campaign to destroy bridges and make roads impassable. But by mid-September, the Luftwaffe no longer had the planes to spare. Resources were being shifted east, where Soviet armies pressed against Germany's borders. The Western Front lost priority. That strategic mistake cost Germany its chance to stabilize the situation in France. Who sat behind the wheel of that colossal convoy that kept the American advance moving in France? Mostly African Americans, former Detroit factory workers, cotton pickers from the South, railroad hands from Chicago. Many had never even driven a car before the Army. After 3 weeks of crash courses at training camps in Texas or California, they were turned into truck drivers and shipped straight across the Atlantic into Europe's inferno. Private William Scott, 26, from Alabama, had earned $3 a week picking cotton before the war. Now, he drove a 5-ton truck loaded with artillery shells, racing through the ruins of France at 50 kilometers per hour under the risk of German fire. In a letter to his wife, he wrote, "Here they don't call me a nigger, here they call me a driver. My cargo is worth more than the color of my skin." In a few lines lay the tragic irony. He received more respect at war than in peace at home. Sergeant Mechanic Charles Stevenson, 30, from Ohio, commanded a Red Ball maintenance platoon. He introduced a quick protocol repair method that cut vehicle downtime from 2 hours to about 30 minutes. The system spread rapidly through the ranks. Soon every maintenance unit was using it. At first, white officers ignored the sergeant's proposals. But when statistics showed nearly a 40% boost in efficiency, they had to recognize his talent. After the war, Stevenson returned home, only to be refused work at a white garage. The front was over, racism was not. White drivers also served in the Red Ball, though fewer in number. Corporal John Miller of Iowa left an honest confession in his diary. At first, he did not want to serve alongside black soldiers. That was how he had been raised. Segregation was normal, prejudice the rule. But weeks on the road beside new comrades broke those beliefs. He saw Private Thomas Johnson keep driving with shrapnel lodged in his shoulder, refusing to stop until his load was delivered. He saw Sergeant Robert Williams pull him from a burning cab at the risk of his own life. After the war, Miller became one of the first white activists for civil rights in Iowa. Women, too, were part of this vast mechanism, though they were rarely mentioned. Nurses, telephone operators, dispatchers at transfer points worked in the same grueling conditions. Lieutenant Jane Roberts managed a dispatch hub near Paris through which up to 500 trucks passed per hour. Her job? Prevent bottlenecks and keep traffic at maximum flow. She went 2 days without sleep, tracking convoys on a giant map and redirecting routes in real time. Her efficiency was so vital that General Omar Bradley came personally to thank her after she ensured the timely delivery of critical ammunition during the battle for Aachen. For the drivers, the greatest danger was not only physical, it was psychological exhaustion. 16 hours in the dark, broken roads, constant stress. A single lapse of attention meant disaster. Men began to hallucinate from sleep deprivation. Pedestrians that weren't there, tanks on the roadside, voices urging them to stop. Field psychiatrists tried to help, but the only real cure was sleep, of which there was none. The operation demanded every driver, every truck, every hour, and everyone knew it. For the French, the Red Ball Express became a visible symbol of liberation. After 4 years of occupation, the same roads once used by the Wehrmacht to haul weapons now carried a torrent in reverse, a torrent that signaled the end of Nazi rule. People lined the roadsides, waving flags, throwing flowers, reaching out to the drivers. Children chased the convoys, shouting, "Merci, America." Old women wept as they watched the endless columns. For many provincial towns, it was their first encounter with African Americans. Surprise quickly gave way to respect. The French saw these soldiers risk their lives bringing fuel and ammunition to those who were freeing their country. The mayor of Chartres, 58-year-old Pierre Dubois, organized a ceremony honoring the Red Ball drivers who passed through. In his speech, he called the black drivers true heroes of liberation. A translation of the speech reached the U.S. press and sparked controversy. In the South, some papers refused to print it, so as not to exaggerate the role of Negroes. In the North, it was quoted in early debates about racial equality. The war was shifting minds, slowly and painfully, but irreversibly. French villagers often helped the convoys in practice. If a truck broke down far from a repair station, farmers brought horses to tow it back to the road. They shared food, offered shelter. A widow from Nantes, Marie Leblanc, turned her home into an informal rest stop. Hot meals, a chance to wash, a place for a brief sleep. Over 3 months, nearly 300 drivers passed through her door. She never took a cent. "My debt for liberation," she said. There were darker episodes too. French women who formed relationships with African American soldiers often became targets of scorn. Traditional prejudices, though softer than America's, still existed. Some were ostracized after the war. Their mixed-race children faced discrimination at school. These stories seldom appear in official liberation chronicles, but for hundreds of families, they were painful realities. German propaganda tried to exploit the racial issue of the Red Ball. Leaflets dropped over French towns portrayed African American soldiers as savages, threatening European civilization, and the Wehrmacht as defenders of purity. The campaign backfired. In reality, the savages proved courteous. Disciplined soldiers saving France from the true barbarians, SS and Gestapo. By late September, the Red Ball Express had become part of the country's daily rhythm. Children played American drivers, pushing carts as trucks. Women along the route set up coffee and bread stands for brief stops. Gray-haired veterans of World War I sat by the roadside, raising a hand to every truck, saluting the close of their second war with Germany. France remembered the Red Ball warmly and with gratitude. America, after victory, quickly let the memory fade, and the operation slipped into near oblivion. By mid-October 1944, losses among Red Ball Express drivers had approached those of frontline infantry units. Officially, 238 dead and over 1,200 wounded in 2.5 months. But numbers do not tell the whole story. Many did not die from bullets, but from exhaustion, heart attacks behind the wheel, crashes caused by micro-sleep, 2 or 3 seconds of blankness at critical speed. Private Elijah Jones, 25, from Mississippi, died at the wheel on October 10th. The autopsy showed a massive heart attack, brought on by prolonged stress and overwork. His truck left the road and overturned. But the cargo, 4 tons of canned rations for field kitchens, remained intact. Comrades testified that Jones had worked 41 straight days without a break. When urged to rest, he answered, "The boys at the front do not get days off, so I have got no right to one either." The most common cause of death was falling asleep while driving. Medicine of the time did not fully grasp the effects of chronic sleep deprivation. Stimulants that later became standard were not used. Men relied on coffee, cigarettes, and sheer willpower. But the body has limits. After 30 to 40 hours without sleep, the brain switches off for a few seconds. At 40 kilometers per hour, a truck travels roughly 50 meters in that time, enough to leave the road, hit a tree, or plunge into a ditch. Captain Physician Andrew Washington, attached to one of the units, kept medical records. He noted that after a month on the job, the average driver showed symptoms akin to combat shock, trembling hands, scattered attention, depression, memory lapses. Today it would be called PTSD. Then they said road fatigue. Washington filed reports demanding mandatory rest periods, but they were ignored. The operation mattered more than the health of individual soldiers. War had no patience for sentiment. German saboteurs added another layer of danger. Large-scale attacks had failed, but small ones continued. Snipers in tree lines, mines on detours, booby traps under bridges. On October 23rd, a sniper hidden in the ruins of a church near Nancy killed 4 drivers in 2 hours before U.S. scouts eliminated him. Cabs were not armored. Thin metal and glass offered no protection. Drivers were easy targets. Psychological pressure grew with the awareness of the stakes. Everyone knew a delay meant someone's death at the front. Sergeant James Parker confessed to an Army psychologist that he was haunted by dreams. The truck breaks down, and tankers die for lack of ammunition. In the morning, he still climbed into the cab. Not to drive would mean betraying his own. Command tried to sustain morale. During the rare long pauses, they put on concerts. The USO sent performers. The legendary Dinah Shore sang in the rain on an improvised stage of crates in November 1944. Thousands of exhausted men stood ankle-deep in mud and forgot the war for an hour. She later said it was the most important concert of her career, more important than Hollywood or Broadway. The GMC CCKW, Jimmy, became the icon of the Red Ball Express, a 6x6, 6-cylinder truck rated to haul 2.5 tons on roads and nearly 4 tons over firm ground, with roughly 90 horsepower and a top speed up to 70 kilometers per hour. Its chief virtue was reliability. Thousands of kilometers without major failure, rain, mud, dust, and it stayed in the fight. By the start of Red Ball, General Motors had built over 500,000 of these trucks. They served everywhere: North Africa, Italy, the Pacific, Burma. But it was in France in the fall of 1944 that the Jimmy showed its full mettle. Engineers had never planned for such a brutal tempo. The average truck logged about 3,000 kilometers per week, more than civilian rigs covered in a year in peacetime. Transmissions overheated, brakes burned out in a week, tires burst under overload. Red Ball mechanics created a lightning service system. What took 2 days in a civilian shop, an engine swap, here took 2 hours. A 4-man crew worked like surgeons. Every motion honed, rolls precise. Old engine out, new engine in, hookups, start. By the time the driver finished his coffee and ration, the truck was back on the road. Efficiency born of desperation became a small repair revolution. After the war, many of these mechanics opened their own garages and carried red ball methods into civilian life. Tires were a perpetual headache. Roads built for light, pre-war traffic ate rubber in days. Goodyear launched a special line of reinforced tires with double cord and thicker tread. But even those did not last long. On average, each truck replaced all 6 tires about once every 10 days. Over 3 months, more than 1 million tires were changed. The tire logistics alone amounted to a small war. Fuel efficiency became critical. A fully loaded CCKW consumed about 30 liters per 100 kilometers. A typical there and back run was approximately 600 kilometers, roughly 360 liters per truck. If 6,000 trucks made 2 trips a week on average, they burned over 4 million liters weekly just for their own needs. The logistics paradox: the farther you haul fuel, the more fuel the hauling itself consumes. Engineers hunted for savings. They experimented with fuel blends and additives. Some worked, some wrecked engines. The most successful fix was simple weight reduction. Remove spare wheels from mid-column trucks, help nearby. Lighten cabs, strip non-essentials, swap steel for aluminum where possible. It cut 100 to 150 kilograms per vehicle, allowing either more payload or less fuel burned. Radio became the nervous system of the operation. Every convoy carried an SCR 300 set, keeping contact with headquarters out to roughly 20 kilometers. Dispatchers tracked columns, adjusted routes, warned of threats. When one convoy hit an ambush near Metz, the radio man managed to transmit a warning 3 minutes before his truck blew. Other columns diverted in time, and the ambush failed. The radio net saved lives daily. September turned to October, and the Red Ball Express faced its hardest trial. Patton's Third Army reached Metz, one of Europe's strongest fortified cities. The Germans had made it a fortress in the 19th century, and now meant to hold it at any cost. The battle for Metz became the bloodiest in France after Normandy, and depended entirely on Red Ball's ability to feed the artillery. The siege began on September 27th. In the first 3 days, American artillery fired over 120,000 shells at the defenses, astronomical volumes. Each shell weighed 15 to 40 kilograms, depending on caliber. Supplying them required concentrating all Red Ball resources on one axis. Other sectors dropped to bare minimum, everything to Metz. The Germans understood the stakes: cut supply and the guns would fall silent. The siege would fail. The Luftwaffe threw its last reserves of fighters and attack aircraft against the columns bound for Metz. On October 5th, the largest air clash over a Red Ball route erupted. 34 Focke-Wulf FW-190s attacked a convoy of about 200 trucks near Verdun. American P-47 Thunderbolts scrambled. Dogfights burst into life above the roads. Drivers moved under fire. The strike aircraft dived, raking the columns with cannon and machine guns. Explosions tore the pavement. Fragments hissed through the air. Trucks burned. But the column did not break. The first vehicle burned. The second skirted the crater and held the pace. Within the convoy, anti-aircraft mounts on special platforms answered, turning the sky into a hell of tracers and falling fire. The fight lasted 12 minutes. The Germans lost 8 aircraft. The Americans, 14 trucks destroyed, 28 damaged, 31 drivers killed, 47 wounded. But 160 vehicles reached their destination, all with full loads of ammunition. That day, the guns at Metz never fell silent for a minute. Inside the fortress, defenders' morale began to crack. The pauses they counted on never came. Patton came to thank them in person. On a staging lot, where exhausted men tried to rest after the raid, he stood before a line of black drivers and spoke words that stuck. "You did the impossible. Without you, my tanks would be dead and my soldiers without ammunition." Skin color means nothing when it comes to courage. For a general with a hard reputation, it was an unusual but genuine tribute. The battle for Metz dragged on 6 more weeks. To that sector, the Red Ball Express hauled over 80,000 tons of ammunition, the densest concentration of fire over such a short span in the European campaign. On November 22nd, Metz fell. The garrison capitulated, the last forts shattered by unbroken cannonade. The Americans lost over 3,000 killed. Without Red Ball, those numbers would have been far higher, and the battle might well have been lost. After Metz fell, German command admitted the obvious. You cannot defeat an enemy with such a logistical edge. General Siegfried Westphal, Chief of Staff in the West, later wrote, "We could stop their tanks and shoot down their planes, but we could not stop their trucks. They drove day and night, and each one carried death for the Reich. We lost not on the battlefield, but on the roads of France." The Red Ball drivers were saving the army, yet every return run reminded them of their place back home. Even in France, American units enforced segregation. Officers' clubs, mess halls, sometimes even field hospitals, were split into white and colored zones. Corporal Robert Jackson of Georgia lived through a telling episode. After 30 hours at the wheel, having delivered critical medicines to a hospital, he walked into the mess. A white sergeant pointed him to another barracks, for coloreds. Jackson sat at an empty table and refused to leave. He was arrested for insubordination, sentenced to 24 hours confinement, and docked 2 weeks' pay. That same day, the drugs he had brought saved 9 white soldiers in that very hospital. The irony was merciless. The French reacted differently. For many women, African-American soldiers were attractive for their difference. Romances began. This enraged some white Americans. Arguments flared, brawls erupted, and there were even hate-fueled murders. Command tried to prohibit interracial relationships, but French women did not obey American orders. In November 1944, an episode shocked even the hardened. In the town of Agnew, white engineer troops attacked a group of black Red Ball drivers in a bar over conversations with French women. The brawl turned into a pogrom. One white soldier drew a pistol and shot Private Charles Williams, a 22-year-old driver from Arkansas, dead. In court, he claimed self-defense and was acquitted in 2 weeks. Outrage among black soldiers was immense and powerless. The paradox bordered on absurd. German POWs were sometimes admitted to white messes, while black American soldiers were not. Red Ball drivers saw it with their own eyes. They hauled supplies to free Europe from Nazi racism, while living under American segregation. Some officers tried to break the system. Lieutenant Colonel John Davis, a white commander of a Red Ball battalion, ordered segregation abolished in his outfit. Shared messes, barracks, showers. Colleagues were furious. He was nearly court-martialed for undermining discipline. But the numbers were stubborn. His battalion posted the highest efficiency and the lowest disciplinary rate in Red Ball. Davis's story spread quickly, giving black servicemen tangible hope. Change was possible. Not all white officers were racists, and professionalism could beat prejudice. After the war, many Red Ball veterans became civil rights activists with a simple argument. If we were worthy of saving America, we are worthy of full citizenship. The French press began writing about discrimination in the U.S. Army, creating a diplomatic headache. European audiences could not fathom how the force-fighting Nazi racism could practice its own. Command tried to smother the stories, but the genie was out. The contradiction was visible and gnawed at America's moral authority as a champion of freedom and democracy. November brought a new ordeal, the European winter. Temperatures fell below freezing, roads glazed with ice, drifts blocked the routes. The GMC CCKW was not designed for such conditions. At -10 degrees, Celsius engines refused to start. Brake fluid thickened dangerously. Tires turned wooden and cracked from cold. After 3 months of non-stop work, the Red Ball Express was on the verge of breakdown. Mechanics labored in conditions close to torture. Repairing in the cold at -15 degrees, Celsius meant frostbite in minutes. Yet the work had to go on. They improvised preheaters, tin cans, kerosene, makeshift baffles, enough to warm engines before cranking. It was dangerous. Several trucks caught fire from the contraptions. But there was no alternative. Engines had to start, fast. Ice ruts demanded skills most drivers had never learned. Many had grown up in southern states and had never seen a real winter. Now, they coaxed multi-ton trucks along snowed-over roads with hidden ice beneath the powder. Accidents spiked. In the first week of December, there were 119 serious incidents, double the autumn average. Trucks slid into ditches, rolled on curves, or piled up under ice breaking. Command rushed instructors from northern states. Training happened literally on the move. An instructor climbed into the cab and taught during a live run how to read the ice under the wheels, brake without lockup, take slippery corners. It proved better than any classroom. Within 2 weeks, accidents dropped by roughly 60%. Snowdrifts were a plague of their own. When drifts hit 1 meter to 1.5 meters, columns simply stopped. No one could wait for a thaw. The front would not wait. Engineer units with bulldozers and plows went in, but it was not enough. Civilians were then hired. Towns were paid for clearing. Hundreds of Frenchmen took shovels and, alongside American soldiers, carved corridors for the convoys. December brought a new threat: the Ardennes counteroffensive. On December 16th, the Germans threw in their last reserves of tanks and infantry, trying to split the front. The Battle of the Bulge became the largest American battle of the war, and once again, everything hinged on logistics. The encircled paratroopers at Bastogne desperately needed ammunition, medicines, and food. The Red Ball Express reconfigured in hours. The main flow swung north toward the Ardennes. Conditions were straight out of a survival manual. Meter-high drifts, minus 20 degrees Celsius. German saboteurs in American uniforms on the roads. But the columns kept going. On December 23rd, when skies cleared and Allied aircraft could drop supplies to Bastogne, the bulk of essentials was already rolling overland. Red Ball delivered critical anti-tank rounds that let the paratroopers beat back armored attacks. The winter of 1944 to 1945 was the harshest stretch for the drivers. They fought not only the enemy and exhaustion, but the weather itself. Frostbite became routine. Many lost fingers or toes. Heating in GMC cabs was token at best. Drivers wore everything they could find, yet hours in metal boxes meant slow freezing. Some died of hypothermia right at the wheel, and still, the operation held. By the end of January 1945, as the German offensive burned out, the Red Ball Express had hauled over 300,000 tons of supplies in winter conditions. A feat at the edge of the possible. Historians would later call this phase of Red Ball the greatest triumph of logistics over nature in the history of war. February 1945 changed the picture. The Allies crossed the Rhine and entered Germany. Supply lines stretched again, but an alternative emerged. French railways were restored, bridges rebuilt, ports running at full tilt. The need for the Red Ball Express in its original emergency form declined. On February 16th, a phased drawdown was approved. That did not mean rest. Drivers shifted to other tasks, supplying armies pushing deeper into Germany, evacuating the wounded, delivering civilian aid to liberated areas. The work continued, but the tempo fell. For the first time in 6 months, real rest periods appeared. Some even received short passes to Paris or other cities. Paris welcomed the Red Ball drivers as heroes. On March 5th, the city held an official ceremony. 2,000 drivers marched down the Champs-Élysées to the applause of tens of thousands of Parisians. A rare moment of public recognition for African-American soldiers who were usually overlooked. The French press wrote about the Black Yanks who saved France, sincerely, without ironic quotes. May 8, 1945, Germany's capitulation. The war in Europe ended. For the Red Ball drivers, the end of a long nightmare. Over 9 months, they had driven more than 180 million kilometers, about 4,500 times around the Earth, delivered over 400,000 tons of cargo, and lost 597 killed and over 2,000 wounded, figures comparable to combat units. Recognition, however, was meager. Newspapers celebrated tankers, pilots, infantry. The drivers of the Red Ball remained invisible. No films, no monuments. In official histories, only a few paragraphs in logistics chapters. Their names did not make the textbooks. Homecoming was often bitter. They had hoped service would change something. They had risked their lives for America. Surely America would recognize them as equals. But segregation in the South remained intact. Red Ball veterans returning to Alabama or Mississippi became second class again. Job refusals, bans from white establishments, segregated schools for their children. Some refused to accept it. They joined the rising civil rights movement of the 1950s. Their experience was an unanswerable argument. How could a nation deny rights to the men who had saved it? The seeds of change had been sown, and they sprouted. Red Ball veterans became part of the generation that changed America. In France, memory of them endured more strongly. Along the old routes, plaques stand, roads bear honorific names. Historians write books about their feat. To the French, these Black American drivers are true heroes of liberation. France did not forget their sacrifice, even if America took far too long to see it. For decades after the war, America's attitude toward the Red Ball Express remained paradoxical. Military historians acknowledged its operational importance, but public memory all but vanished. In the 1950s, a handful of articles appeared in specialist journals, while mass culture worshipped tank breakthroughs, air duels, and fortress assaults, yet not a single film about the truck drivers who made those victories possible. Part of the oblivion stemmed from post-war racial politics. The 1950s were the peak of segregation. The South seethed against desegregation. Acknowledging the heroism of African American soldiers undermined the very ideology of second-class status. The logical contradiction was resolved simply by silence, but the veterans remembered. In the 1960s, alongside the rise of the civil rights movement, former Red Ball drivers became active protest participants. Their service conferred moral authority. When Alabama police beat peaceful demonstrators, among them stood men who had hauled ammunition under German bombs. They did not beg for favors. They demanded what they had earned. In 1955 in Montgomery, Martin Luther King Jr. invoked the Red Ball Express as a symbol of injustice. They carried supplies to liberate Europe from tyranny and return to a country where they themselves were not free. They fought Nazi racism, only to meet Jim Crow racism at home. This must end. Those words resonated with millions. The Red Ball story became part of the broader narrative of the struggle for equality. In the 1970s came a rethinking of World War II that accounted for the contributions of many communities. Scholars turned to African American units, Japanese American formations, and Latinos. Red Ball finally received academic attention. Dissertations, monographs, documentaries. Veterans gave interviews and deposited materials in archives. A Frenchman from Reims, Jean-Paul Pallier, devoted 20 years to Red Ball. He drove every route, interviewed hundreds of witnesses in France, and tracked down veterans in the U.S. In 1992, his monumental book, Red Ball, The Forgotten Heroes of Liberation, was published, a bestseller in France, translated into several languages. The world finally received a coherent history. Even in the 1990s, recognition in America remained scant. In 1997, a group of veterans held a reunion in Washington. Only 43 men came. Most had already passed on, the survivors well into their 80s. They gathered at the future site of the World War II Memorial and laid a wreath. The press barely noticed, brief items on inside pages. One of them, 92-year-old Sam Johnson, told the Washington Post, "We are not looking for glory. We want people to know the truth, for grandkids to understand their grandfathers did something that mattered. We are part of the victory, even if history forgot us." It was not bitterness, just the calm dignity of a generation that knew its worth. In the 2000s, as the last veterans passed away, interest in their stories rose again. Oral history projects, museum exhibits, school visits. The Red Ball Express finally took its place in public memory. Few lived to see it, but those who did felt, for the first time, the recognition they had awaited for 60 years. The Red Ball Express changed the very lens through which war was viewed. Before it, logistics was necessary but secondary. Strategists loved to talk about maneuver and firepower. Supply was a necessary burden. Red Ball proved the opposite. Logistics decides campaigns, sometimes more decisively than brilliant tactics. After the war, the U.S. Army conducted a detailed audit. From it emerged a doctrine still relevant today. Core principles: speed matters more than thrift. Surplus beats shortage. Flexibility beats rigid planning. obvious now, revolutionary in 1945. The Prussian school demanded the perfect plan to the gram, but Red Ball showed that real war is ruled by chaos. Better to carry reserve and adapt quickly than to shatter an ideal scheme on first contact with reality. The concept of dedicated supply routes became a NATO standard. In every major operation, from Korea to Afghanistan, red corridors appeared, where logistics had absolute priority. Road signs with a red circle became the international language of supply. See one on a base anywhere, and you remember the French autumn of 1944. The continuous convoy system influenced the civilian sector too. After the war, express delivery companies studied Red Ball. Federal Express, 1971, borrowed key principles: hubs, overnight legs, standardized loading. Its founder, Frederick Smith, wrote his Yale thesis precisely on Red Ball logistics and later carried those lessons into business. Every time you see overnight delivery, you hear the echo of those night convoys across France. Technologies born of necessity became standards. Rapid engine swaps prefigured modular automotive design. Refueling on the move foreshadowed aerial refueling. Radio convoy coordination underpinned modern fleet management systems. What was invented in desperation survived in peace. Military academies adopted Red Ball as a case study. At West Point, St. Cyr, and Sandhurst, cadets learn how well-organized logistics can offset tactical shortcomings, even an enemy's edge in weaponry. The exam classic, How Did the Americans Sustain Their Offensive Tempo in the Fall of 1944, has a correct answer. Not Sherman, not air superiority, but the Red Ball Express. Soviet theorists also paid close attention. Post-war intelligence gathered extensive data on Red Ball. Marshals were astonished by the scale. Attempts to replicate the principles ran into systemic differences. The American model relied on bottom-up initiative, on drivers and mechanics being empowered to improvise. The USSR's centralized bureaucracy could not order flexibility by decree, and the overarching lesson, the role of ordinary soldiers in grand strategy. Generals plan battles, but drivers, mechanics, signalers, and medics make them possible. Hence Omar Bradley's oft-quoted line, "Amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics," a view shaped by Red Ball and its kin operations. What became of the people who were the face of the Red Ball Express? Their post-war biographies trace the complex arc of American race relations. Some found success, many met disappointment, and almost all carried scars, physical and psychological. Charles Stevenson, the sergeant mechanic behind the revolutionary repair protocol, returned to Ohio and met a cascade of refusals because of his skin color. He opened a small garage in Cleveland's black neighborhood. It was hard, but he endured. By the 1960s, his business was among the city's most successful. He built an integrated team. Black and white worked side by side. He died in 1989, leaving the shop to his sons. James Parker, the sergeant haunted by nightmares of broken trucks, suffered from what we would now call PTSD. He could not keep jobs, drank heavily, and his family fell apart. In 1953, he took his own life, a sadly typical story of invisible losses, especially among African Americans who received poorer veterans' care under segregation. Robert Jackson, the corporal arrested for refusing the colored mess, became a lawyer and civil rights advocate. He defended black defendants in the South at risk to his life. In 1962, the Klan burned his house. He survived and did not give up. He lived to 92 and witnessed the election of America's first black president. In 2008, he said, "I drove under bombs so my grandchildren could live free. Now, I see it was not in vain." John Miller, the white corporal who revised his own prejudices, became a history teacher in Iowa. He taught students about Red Ball, highlighting the heroism of black drivers. In the 1960s, he was fired for promoting race mixing, but former students remembered the lessons. Some became civil rights activists, one became a state senator, and passed a school desegregation bill. Jane Roberts, the dispatcher, moved into civil aviation and became one of the first female air traffic controllers in the United States. Coordinating hundreds of trucks made managing airplanes organizationally simpler. She retired in 1978 and later wrote memoirs about Red Ball. Marie LeBlanc, The French widow who turned her home into a rest station corresponded with dozens of veterans and visited the United States 3 times. In 1994, she attended the last Red Ball reunion. Old men wept as they embraced the woman who had given them warmth half a century earlier. She was posthumously awarded the Légion d'honneur for her contribution to Franco-American friendship. Many stayed silent to the end. Trauma, post-war discrimination, and the sense of an underappreciated sacrifice took their toll. Families often learned the truth only after death, finding medals, papers, photographs. Hundreds of stories vanished that no one will ever tell, but others survived. Grandchildren recorded memories on tape. Local societies gathered oral histories. Archives swelled with documents. Piece by piece, a coherent picture emerges of heroism, sacrifice, injustice, and, ultimately, the triumph of human endurance. Today, 80 years on, we can better see the scale of the Red Ball Express. It was not the decisive battle, not a single turning point, but it made everything else possible. Without Red Ball, Patton's tanks would have stopped, Bradley's armies would have gone dry, the Allied advance would have stalled in September 1944. The war might have dragged on another year or two, the price measured in millions of lives. What shocked the Germans was not one night of suddenly refueled tanks. It was a system capable of doing the impossible every single day for 9 months. They were used to wars where logistics lagged behind tactics and armies halted for lack of supplies. The Americans proposed a different approach, strangle the enemy with an unbroken flow of materiel so that every frontline soldier had more than enough. The German economy and transport simply could not compete. But beyond the numbers, people, 23,000 drivers, mechanics, and dispatchers, mostly African Americans, citizens of second-class status in their own country. They had plenty of reasons not to sacrifice themselves, yet they did, out of patriotism, duty, or simply because there was no choice. The result is the same: they hastened the end of Nazism. That achievement is theirs, whatever their motives. The paradox is that their sacrifice changed America itself. Veterans, black and white, returned with a different experience. People of different races can work together and win. Prejudice is not the nature of things, but a choice. That knowledge fed the civil rights movement that broke Jim Crow. Red Ball did not create the movement, but its veterans became an important part of it. Along French roads stand memorial signs, small plaques with a red circle. Here ran the route of the Red Ball Express, which liberated France in 1944. The French remember better, because it is their land and their liberation. To Americans, it was one operation among many on a distant front, but memory is returning. In the 21st century, as racial issues sit again at the center of debate, the Red Ball story sounds new. It reminds us that African Americans have always been inseparable from American history. Heroism has no color, only the circumstances in which people reveal the best in themselves. Has everything changed since 1945? In some ways, yes. Segregation is outlawed. African Americans hold high office in politics, business, and culture. In others, the struggle continues. Economic inequality, bias in the justice system, unequal starting lines. Red Ball veterans fought for ideals America is still striving to fulfill. The most important Red Ball lesson is human. Ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances can do the extraordinary. Drivers who nodded into microsleep yet kept the wheel. Mechanics who brought engines back to life with bare hands in freezing air. Dispatchers who held hundreds of moving trucks in their heads for 48 sleepless hours. They were not superhuman. They simply did the job when it seemed impossible. This is the true legacy of the Red Ball Express, not only in tons and kilometers, but in the reminder of what devotion and courage and persistence can do. In a world of new divisions, the story of people who work together offers hope. If they could overcome racism, fear, and exhaustion, so can we overcome our barriers? On that September night in 1944, Germans watched in shock as dead tanks came to life. But the deeper shock was philosophical. They faced a power grounded not in racial superiority or authoritarian discipline, but in the common labor of different people. In that lay America's advantage, and our shared hope still. The memory of the Red Ball Express is not only about the past, It is a reminder of values worth fighting for: equality, justice, human dignity. Those who hauled freight across France fought for those ideals, even if they did not always enjoy their fruits. Their struggle continues in every generation that tries to make the world a little fairer and more humane. Do we remember them enough? Probably not. But as long as someone tells their story, studies their sacrifice, and preserves their memories, they live on. And their legacy urges us to be better, work harder, and dream bolder. That is the Red Ball Express's truest victory, not only in cargo delivered, but in a human spirit that refused to give in.